Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Correct.
Thank you very much for being with us, Andrew. I want to start with a broad question. Where are we at in Syria in terms of the U.S.-Turkish relationship?
Well, the recent developments are definitely going to inflame the relationship. The U.S. considers Turkey to be a regional partner. Turkey is, of course, a NATO alliance. There are over 1,600 U.S. troops currently stationed in Turkey, and there are, in fact, U.S. nuclear weapons stationed in Turkey as well. And so the U.S., I think, is oriented to view Turkey as a potential partner and wants to work with it long term. When the President Erdogan threatens area that's currently controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are predominantly Kurdish, and that the U.S. also considers an ally, it injects a great deal of tension into the relationship, and I think threatens not only the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey, but also the U.S. counterterrorism mission against Daesh in the south of the country.
Right, and U.S.-Turkish relationship in the past couple of years hasn't been really good. It's really fluctuating. Sometimes there's some improvements, and sometimes it goes down really bad. And this is something that's known in the Washington and among the think tanks. And I just want to point to one recent article by one of the Turkey analysts or experts, Stephen Cook, who wrote his annual Thanksgiving article, in which he says he's referring to U.S. being sick of Turkey. Now, I want to ask that question to you, put that question to you. Is Washington sick of Turkey?
I wouldn't quite say that. I think, as you mentioned, the relationship is volatile. The personalities involved on both sides, I think at some times are willing to make quick decisions that change the variables on the ground. I don't think the U.S. is about to cast Turkey overboard. I don't think that the NATO alliance is threatened as of now. If Turkish and American troops start shooting at each other, maybe that's another question. But I don't think the U.S. is done with Turkey. I think the Turkish relationship now is at potentially a difficult stage, but I don't see a permanent ramification if things don't escalate beyond where they are now.
And in Washington, help us understand the Washington's perspective towards Turkey. Is there a consensus on because there are some calls for a need for reassessing the alliance between U.S. and Turkey. Is there a consensus among the Washington politicians in White House and the Trump administration?
I'm not sure there's any consensus in Washington. I know that Turkey, as I mentioned before, is viewed as a potential partner. And so on one hand, there's a kind of bipolarity to the view of Turkey, because it's a very enticing partner that has a strong track record of being unified with the U.S. against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Turkey's relationship with the U.S. has been stronger as of even a few years ago than it is today. And so I think it's always this enticing ally. On the other hand, the direction that Turkey's been pursuing, especially over the last few years, as President Erdogan has further consolidated power, as it's picked fights with the U.S., as it's conducted operations in Afrin, have also exposed and underscored and reiterated certain liabilities that are implicit in the current U.S.-Turkish relationship.
Right, and I'm actually glad that you mentioned Afrin, because when the operation in Afrin happened, the U.S. had no troops in Afrin. That's on the other side of the Euphrates River. Yes. But now in the eastern side, or in where Turkey is threatening to attack, there are U.S. troops, approximately 2,000. I believe you said 1,600, but there are
to clarify, there are 1,600 U.S. troops in Turkey right now as part of a permanent rotational. The U.S. has bases in Turkey. I meant to emphasize the close military-to-military relationship that historically has taken place between Turkey and the U.S. There are officially 2,000 troops, U.S. troops in eastern Syria right now supporting the SDF, training, advising, coordinating air power. So yeah, please think of those as different segments.
Right, definitely. And also these troops, they recently they started having observational posts between Turkey and the Kurdish region in Syria. But what I wanted to ask was that in Afrin it was a different case. In Afrin there was no U.S. troops there. Now in eastern Syria there are U.S. troops, and with the military, any form of military operation by Turkey in that region, it really risks the huge escalation of conflict and possibly confrontation between U.S. and Turkish troops. Now, when we saw the Turkish statement of threatening to launch an operation in eastern Syria, I think that was the first time that I actually saw a response, not a coherent, but like a firm response,
a specific response yes.
from
so
the Pentagon.
I think the Pentagon has a reciprocal mentality when it comes to Erdogan's threats. So in the past, Erdogan, in vague terms, has indicated his interest in seizing certain towns that are currently controlled by the SDF and that are on the other side of the Turkish-Syrian border in northeastern Syria. The Pentagon has reiterated its distaste for this, but in the past this has been a more general affirmation of the need to essentially retain the integrity of Syria. Because Erdogan has been so specific this time, and when I say specific, he hasn't talked in vague terms about retaking the east. He said a specific military operation will happen in the next few days. There have been indications that he's mobilizing his forces on the opposite side of, say, Tel Abyad. These are factors that indicate that the threat this time is more serious, and I think the Pentagon response has been more serious in kind. And so instead of staying a vague statement that gives Erdogan more room to climb down, to reassess, the Pentagon spokesperson was extremely forceful and said any unilateral action will be unacceptable.
Right, and some of the analysts from the past few days when I was scanning the news, there's a thought that also, Turkey giving 3-4 days in advance was probably intended to gauge the U.S. response to the Turkish threats or Turkish plans to carry out an operation there. But I want to ask another question in terms of if this, I know this is a hypothetical question, sure. But, and I don't mean it to ask it in a technical manner, but what tools U.S. has at their disposal to prevent Turkey from such an attack?
Sure. So I think of the U.S. response or potential response, since we're dealing with hypotheticals, into two basic baskets. One is a linear basket in terms of what the U.S. should do right now on the ground in Syria to deter further Turkish threats. And then the other is a nonlinear basket that draws upon certain tools and points of leverage in the broader U.S.-Turkey relationship. So the way I see it in terms of the linear response, in terms of what the U.S. should do in Syria on the ground, falls into three categories. It could essentially do nothing, lodge a diplomatic protest, send President Erdogan a strongly worded letter or something, and hope for the best, which I think is a very unlikely option, given that this would probably just encourage Erdogan to continue to move his military into East Syria, and we might see a repeat of Afrin, which is something I don't think the U.S. wants. The most aggressive or assertive response could be physically inserting U.S. troops into the towns that are most obviously threatened, for example, Tel Abyad. It should be noted that when Erdogan's military started shelling Tel Abyad and Kobani in the end of October, beginning of November, the U.S. did just this. It had inserted U.S. forces and created U.S. manned outposts to act as a kind of deterrence measure against Turkish incursion. The in-between response would be to establish U.S. outposts directly surrounding the towns in question, so that if Erdogan, in fact, does move his military into those towns, they can't move any farther. So you quarantine the towns with a combination of SDF and U.S. assets and ensure that even if Erdogan takes the city itself, he can't move west, he can't move east, he can't move south, and you've somewhat hedged the threat. So in terms of what the U.S. can do within Syria right now, those are the three options. Nothing, insertion, or something in between. Let's call it quarantine. The second basket, the nonlinear response, is what the U.S. can do in terms of the broad relationship. There are three particular pressure points that come to mind. The first is a sanctions regime. The Trump administration has been very aggressive in using the Treasury Department as a kind of in-between measure of asserting leverage between simple diplomacy and the kinetic options in the military. And I think if the Trump administration threatened to designate certain Turkish businesses or certain Turkish individuals as recourse for moving the Turkish military into East Syria, this probably would catch the attention of President Erdogan, especially given the recent economic difficulties in Turkey. Another point of leverage is the F-35, which is an American-developed fifth-generation multi-role stealth fighter. Turkey is currently in line to receive 100 of these. None have been delivered right now. The U.S. Congress is already very uncomfortable with this. President Trump and the State Department have particular power in sidelining the delivery of such fifth-generation weapon systems to Turkey. Using that as leverage could be another way that the U.S. could exert its convince Turkey how serious it is about these recent threats. And then the last point of leverage is the Iran sanction waiver. So Turkey was given a waiver and allowed to import 60,000 barrels a day of Iranian oil over the recent snapback sanctions that the U.S. imposed against Iran. If the U.S. threatened to reduce that number or eliminate it altogether, this would put great strain on Turkey's energy and construction sector and further exacerbate its economic difficulties. And so I know that there's a lot of options on the table, but what I want to emphasize is that the U.S. really does have real powerful tools at its disposal to convince Erdogan that it's serious about protecting the integrity of East Syria beyond simple phone calls and beyond letters and beyond empty words.
Right, and I assume any one of these options, Erdogan will have very good ground for using that domestically, because in the past we've seen when, with the sanctions against two Turkish ministers and even with the observational post in between Turkey and the Kurdish-held areas, Erdogan was able to package it back home saying, look, they are protecting the terrorists, they're not protecting the
Yes, of course. And a critical variable that we haven't quite touched on yet is the fact that Erdogan is going to be facing elections in March domestically. And so I would actually argue that no matter what the U.S. does, Erdogan is going to try to position it as a kind of victory. If the U.S. pushes back hard and President Erdogan backs down, he'll talk about how the U.S. is hypocritical in protecting alleged terrorists and how you need to re-elect and continue to consolidate power behind a strong leader to act as a counterweight to the U.S. If the U.S. gives away the store and allows a lot of Turkey to run rampant in East Syria, then he'll be able to say, look at what a strong leader I am, look at what I did. And so I think if we're trying to position U.S. policy to appease Erdogan's domestic audience, we might find ourselves disappointed because no matter what we do, he's going to try to position that in a way that redounds to his benefit. And so I think it's important to separate the attempts to preempt Erdogan propaganda and really focus on the underlying power variables. And I think at the end of the day, when Erdogan is considering a significant military operation into Syria, he has a risk calculus, and he's thinking, okay, well, we know there's certain liabilities and risks if I do this, and there's a potential reward. If the expected reward exceeds the risk, I'll do it. And if the risk is greater than the reward, maybe I don't. And what I'm saying, and with some of these policies I've laid out, I think would allow us to do, is change the risk calculus from Erdogan's perspective so that the risk greatly outweighs whatever expected rewards he could hope to achieve.
Right. So I also want to talk about the U.S.'s packaging of why U.S. is in Syria, and if the word excuse is the right word, for the alliance with the YPJ and the SDF and the Kurdish forces there. Of course, U.S. recognizes PKK as a terrorist organization, and YPJ, they might have some ideological or some other forms of links to the PKK, although YPJ denies that link, right? But U.S. has constantly said that we're there in Syria to fight ISIS and defeat ISIS for good. I know recently, and we'll probably talk about that too, recently that kind of, the U.S. expanded their U.S. policy in Syria. But the excuse that we're here in Syria and we're supporting the YPJ because we want to fight ISIS has given Erdogan a lot of material to work with. You know, like, okay, sure, ISIS is almost gone, why they're still there? What's your assessment of that kind of packaging up until now? To me, obviously, I mean, U.S. is there for not just defeating ISIS, or even from the very beginning, it was obvious that U.S. was not in Syria just to defeat ISIS. And also, even if it's to defeat ISIS, that doesn't necessarily justify in a Turkish mindset the alliance and arming a group of fighters that Turkey sees as terrorists?
Yes. Instead of excuse, I might say explanation.
Okay.
Speaking of positioning.
That's more of a Washington perspective,
Yes.
and that's the program is
well,
called.
we're in Washington, so
right,
you know,
right.
what in
No,
Washington.
I mean the program
do
is
as a
called
Washington
Washington Perspective, anyways. Yeah.
Yes. So you're correct. The stated mission of Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the mission mandate to justify U.S. troops in East Syria, is narrowly defined as a counterterrorism to defeat ISIS. I would slightly push back against your assertion that the U.S. always had designs to do more. I think the Obama administration, and even until recently the Trump administration, has been very focused on that and has not necessarily started thinking of Syria as a kind of great power conflict until fairly recently. Even Trump, as earlier as this year, President Trump was making noises about, what's the value of the U.S. troops there? Should we pull them out? This is another very complicated Middle East conflict. Maybe this isn't the best use of Pentagon resources. That's changed over the past few months, as you mentioned. And just to give you 3 specific examples. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, our highest diplomat, has specifically said that reconstruction in Assad-controlled territory will not go forward until there is significant political reform on the other side, which seems a bit hopeful in my view. But it's a recognition of the fact that the U.S. is willing to exert its leverage and stick with the country, Syria, long term. Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, our special envoy there, has laid out 3 terms that would allow the U.S. to leave the country. The 3 terms are as follows: a significant political reformation in accordance with UN Resolution 2254, removal of all Iranian proxy forces, and the defeat of ISIS not just as a territorial entity, but as an organization as well. And so conceivably, even if the SDF reconquers all the space, the physical space controlled by ISIS, one might still justify U.S. presence as long as the organization exists. Now, personally, I find the idea that any one of those thresholds can be met very implausible. The idea that all 3 can simultaneously be met seems a tall order, to say the least. And so I think functionally, the U.S. troops are going to be there, and there's a recognition with the administration that U.S. troops are going to be there for a long time. Hence the very strong and immediate pushback by the Pentagon when President Erdogan has said things that would potentially threaten the U.S. presence there. And of course, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, has reaffirmed the points as laid out by Ambassador Jeffrey. And so, yes, I think that there was this initial impetus to defeat ISIS. That was the most immediate threat. But the administration now, I believe, views Syria along a wider spectrum and sees the threats that would happen if it pulled out and allowed Iran to set up shop in East Syria, if it allowed Assad to reconquer the country, if Russia was given full control, or if, frankly, if Turkey was, without any outside check, allowed to do whatever it wanted in Afrin and East Syria. And so I would just push back slightly against the notion that the U.S. today is only thinking about it in a counterterrorism context, even if it focuses rhetorically on the counterterrorism mission.
Right, and the timing of expanding U.S. policies in Syria, I want to ask a couple of questions on that.
Please do.
First is the timing realistic? Because Syria right now is a chaos. You have all these proxies, you have all these countries that are involved, and just announcing the Ambassador James Jeffrey's announcement of okay, we're expanding the mission, if that's the right word, of U.S. in Syria is to defeat ISIS as well as impacting or affecting the political process, how it goes, and getting rid of the proxies, Iranian proxies, sure, in Syria. But that also gave Turkey more concerns about, okay, what is U.S. plans in Syria? Hussein Chalik, one of the Turkish, and a couple of others, as a matter of fact, that specifically stated that they're there to train the Kurds. They're there to establish some sort of, it's just like the timing of announcing that statement where there wasn't a coherent alliance on what to do in Syria In your view, was it like a good timing?
Well, it's true that Turkey is very concerned about the idea of a residual Turkish-dominated force, and these recent moves come after certain quotes have been in the media about how the U.S. wants to expand and permanently codify the Syrian Democratic Force as a security lever in East Syria. And so it's important, I think, to view Turkish comments and Turkish action in that context. I would also note, though, that the move against Afrin by Turkey happened before there was this clear affirmation that the U.S. is going to stay there. I mean, I think that Turkey views the Kurdish question, both in Afrin and in the East, as an existential security threat, irrespective of what the U.S. does. And so, if the U.S. were to pull out, I don't think Turkey would then feel like it could just ignore the rest of the country. I think would view that as a kind of license to take more assertive action, the kind of which Erdogan is threatening this week.
Right, and so the threats that Turkey sees coming from the northeastern Syria, YPJ spokespersons have in the past said we're ready to sit down with Turkey, sure, and to see some way to work out things in there. I think one of the biggest things that Turkey has is that you're linked to PKK. PKK is a terrorist organization. U.S. recognizes PKK as a terrorist organization that has really worked not so well for U.S. In Syria so far. But I guess do you see any possible way that Turkey and the Kurds in Syria could come into some form, some terms there? Yeah,
as strange as it sounds, I actually do.
You do?
I think that there might be some, assuming they don't go to war in the meantime, I think there might be some more room for maneuver after the Turkish election in March, and Erdogan doesn't have to worry about appeasing nationalists for a very long time. He'll have further consolidated his political control over the security apparatus, which in a strange way might actually benefit this possibility because, or I should say support this possibility, because even though President Erdogan recently has been very, very hardline against the Kurds in the East, here's also someone who led the peace negotiations against the PKK a number of years back, and someone who will have so consolidated his control of the security apparatus that some of the bureaucratic and institutional countermeasures that otherwise might take place to prevent a quick pivot towards the Kurds would no longer exist. I mean, it seems plausible to me that if Erdogan is convinced that there's a good deal for Turkey on the table, he'll actually be able to pivot very quickly and get the Turkish bureaucracy behind him, because the Turkish bureaucracy right now is functionally under him.
Right.
And in my view, I think there are actually a surprising amount of common interest between Kurds in East Syria and Turkey if Turkey can be thoroughly convinced that there's no threat emanating from the YPG into Turkish territory. And I think that we've talked about this potential break or distinction between PKK and YPG. And I know that there are a lot of things in common. There's some operational connections currently as well, from what I understand, even though there's a great amount of debate about it. If any deal, I think, would be predicated on a more formal break between the PKK and the YPG. At current, I think it's a bit hard to imagine the U.S. undesignating the PKK, which I think would completely torpedo its relationship with Turkey. But if the YPG were to take some more significant measures as part of a much broader deal and security arrangement to reduce its ties to the PKK, that might give Erdogan a bit of an opening to come to the table. And so once you come to the table, I think you can realize that in some ways these two areas, East Syria and Turkey, fit together well. So for example, the Turkish economy is in a lot of trouble. It's specifically its construction sector.
Right.
East Syria needs a lot of reconstruction. Turkey imports a great deal of oil. It hasn't been able to import as much as it is needed from Iran. The area currently controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces contains 90% of Syria's remaining oil. That you can see how there's certain things that might align incentives. And so I don't think it's crazy to think about it. And I don't think that it's in Turkey's interest. I don't think it's in the Kurdish interest or the Syrian Democratic Forces' interest. I certainly don't think it's in American interest to have the area that's currently controlled and secured by the SDF made into functional Iranian territory, functional Russian territory, to have Assad reconquer it and give him an open hand for torturous recriminations against everyone who fought against him, which is a great many people. And so I think if the border issue is serious, But if the U.S. can just find a way to get both of those sides to be comfortable at these flashpoint towns such as Kobani and Tel Abyad, maybe this means joint U.S. patrols with someone else, something to convince the YPG that Turkey's now to come south, something to convince Turkey that the YPG is not going to come north, and it's combined with the kind of more formal break between PKK and YPG, you might have the beginnings of a very interesting conversation about securing the mutually shared long-term interests of U.S., Turkey, and SDF in the eastern part of the country.
So I remember we had a conversation a while ago on what can U.S. do in Syria, and from what I hear now, if I heard it correctly, is that Turkish opening is kind of relying on a formal break between the YPJ and the PKK, or at least officially, you know. But is that possible? Is YPJ? I know you're you're looking into Syria. You're an expert on the country. So is that something that can be done?
Well, we won't know unless we really try, and there's good reason on both sides to be skeptical. And I think, as I've laid out, there's some reason for hope as well. There's a reason why President Erdogan and the YPG don't trust each other very much, and so just overcoming that will be immensely difficult. And I think it's a bit hard to gauge. This might be a question for the leaders of YPJ, how comfortable they would be severing some of the more tangible operational ties. And so I don't think it's realistic to expect YPJ and PKK to become these totally separate entities that have nothing in common and nothing to do with one another, and no philosophical solidarity. But there are, I think, things one can do on the ground to make Erdogan feel a little less worried about what he might view as a kind of, in his view, a kind of mass security threat emanating from the east, and then from the south as well, as the SDF has taken more territory.
Right, and just a little more on that PKK and YPJ link. I think some people think it's a link that ensures the survivability of YPJ, but any form of delinking YPJ from PKK, although some other people don't share that thought. The YPJ in Syria is reconfiguring its structure. Yes, ideologically they're still, share the same ideology, but to some people it's the survivability. If YPJ delinks itself from PKK, then I assume that they would have to totally depend on U.S.
Oh, yes. So the security concern is a legitimate one from the perspective of the YPJ, and any kind of break or any rapprochement between Turkey and the YPG would have to be politically and from a security standpoint underwritten by U.S. guarantees of some kind.
Right. But YPJ putting itself in a position where they have to completely depend on U.S., and given the recent history of the U.S.-Kurdish relationship, when other actors get involved, U.S. is, we've seen in the past that some Kurds complain that sometimes U.S. has walked away. It's something that I don't think at this time, right now, YPJ has full confidence of saying, okay, I can delink myself from PKK and work with the U.S., although they are working with U.S. But the PKK link, it looks like it's a backup kind of refuge.
Sure. If they can't count on the U.S., then they have the PKK, who will always be there as they're just across the border, and I don't think the PKK is going anywhere anytime soon. So this is a legitimate concern. I fully acknowledge this up front. And as I mentioned, this potential break, the specifics, of course, matter, and we're still at a very high level theoretical conversation, but I think it would require a more well-defined and explicitly residual U.S. presence in East Syria. I think would require certain guarantees from President Erdogan and from Turkey as well. I'm not suggesting that this is something the YPG should just do. I'm saying this is a potential chip on the table that could be traded as part of a broader deal.
Right, and I think recently also James Jeffrey kind of hinted at the idea or floated the idea that we can probably replicate the KRG, or the Iraqi Kurdistan's model in Syria, where there's a no-fly zone enforced possibly by UN, and having the YPJ kind of work with Turkey. But it looks like, from what I hear, that's a possibility that you can also see it coming, in the future between Turkey and the YPJ there.
Potentially, and if the YPG, the territory controlled by SDF, dominated by the YPG, is benefiting immensely with foreign direct investment from Turkey, from trade. They're able to export their oil to Turkey, and so they're able to gain economic resources that way. If you can link those two economically, that won't solve all the issues, but it can at least give a sustained shared incentive to retain a kind of working relationship. I'm not expecting YPG and President Erdogan and Turkey will ever be having tea together for fun, but it's just a question of getting them to have a professional relationship to the point where they're not actively threatening military action. And maybe this means there's some kind of permanent U.S. outpost on the border towns to make sure, again, to assure Turkey that the YPG is not going north, to assure the SDF that Turkey's not going to come south. And perhaps that's implausible. I think it was less plausible maybe a year ago than it is now. But I would point to the response by the U.S. to the most recent threats emanating from Turkey. What has happened? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, our highest diplomat, has been on the phone immediately with his counterpart. General Dunford, our Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest uniformed military officer in the U.S., has been on the phone with his counterpart. And the Pentagon statement was as forceful and specific as we've seen with respect to the question of East Syria and Turkish military operations. So it seems to me that the U.S. recognizes the importance of retaining the integrity of the East. And if it recognizes the importance today, perhaps it can recognize it tomorrow if there's a viable political and economic end state that it can underwrite.
Right, and just the level of attention from Washington, obviously, in the recent month, it has been, in my view, has been a lot more than before.
Yes.
Before Ambassador James Jeffrey being appointed to the U.S. Special Representative to Syria, but just 3-4 days before the Turkish threat, James Jeffrey made a trip to, or visited Ankara, where they had some meetings. And it doesn't look like the negotiations behind the table, things that I don't know, maybe you do or some other people do, but the negotiations behind the curtains are going very well between U.S. and
so you're saying they are or they're not?
They're not.
That's what I understand as well.
Right. Yeah, I don't think they're going very well. And every time that this kind of so it's not just the issues that happen in Syria where Turkey starts threatening, but there's a lot more or contesting issues between the two, and sometimes when the negotiations don't go well on that, you see implications of that coming out in Syria, I would assume.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. As you described, Ambassador Jeffries was in Ankara last week, and it's perhaps no coincidence that we're seeing what we're seeing from President Erdogan this week. It seems that the negotiations did not go particularly well, and Erdogan appears to be trying to create some leverage that he can use to establish something more favorable, specifically in Manbij, against the U.S. And I think the key here is watching the U.S. response. So if Ambassador Jeffries had gone to Ankara and you had seen this announcement of the operations and the U.S. was silent or gave some very light platitude about stability, then you might be prone to wonder, well, what did Ambassador Jeffries agree with Turkey? Did he give some kind of consent? I think the forcefulness of the pushback by the U.S. immediately to President Erdogan's proposed operation suggests that the opposite is true, that in fact the negotiations Erdogan did not get what he wants. He didn't get the resolution he wanted in Manbij. He didn't get the resolution he wanted in Kobani and Tel Abyad. And now he's lashing out and trying to create new facts on the ground that he can potentially trade later for political benefit, especially in the context of this election that's coming up domestically in Turkey this March.
Right, and I think Erdogan also did say that we'll go to Manbij and then we'll negotiate. he did say something along those lines when...
But you mentioned the importance of U.S. troops as a political tripwire. In other words, when U.S. troops get killed, that's a very big deal. And that immediately gets the president's attention. That immediately gets the Pentagon's attention. And that has tremendous political fallout, not just in Washington, but throughout the entire country, throughout the world. The U.S. and Turkey are nominally still doing joint patrols outside of Manbij. And so if Turkey has designs to take Manbij, they're going to have to go through U.S. troops. And that is a political risk I think Erdogan would be unwilling to take and should be unwilling to take. If he's that reckless and he's willing to essentially drive over U.S. troops, shoot through U.S. troops to get what he wants, then we are living in another reality. And if U.S. troops and Turkish troops start shooting at each other, that is what would start to threaten not just the U.S.-Turkish relationship narrowly, but the NATO alliance as a whole. And so I don't think President Erdogan, as frustrated as he might be with the development of the Manbij negotiations, it's hard for me to see him take that kind of risk, especially over Tel Abyad and Manbij.
Right. So I know that this is a very broad question, and we probably were talking about it earlier, but the outstanding issues between the two countries are too many.
So two countries being Turkey and the U.S.?
Turkey and the U.S., of course, yes. But where do you see this relationship going, especially when the threats are now coming and we might possibly see some sort of, probably not a full military, I don't believe the full military operation will be, taking place by, in Syria by Turkey, but where does this new development take this relationship between U.S. and Turkey, not just in Syria, but in general?
Nowhere good.
Nowhere good.
Nowhere good. A lot depends on what happens on the ground. If Turkey is able to be talked down and somehow the U.S. is able to avert a kind of military crisis on the border before March elections, perhaps the elections give the U.S. and Turkey a chance to reset because Erdogan doesn't have to worry about the domestic pressure quite as much, and they can come to some broader arrangement in the region. And again, given how quickly both President Trump and President Erdogan are able to move on issues and pivot on issues, it's not inconceivable to me that if the facts on the ground change or the facts change domestically in Turkey, the two governments could come together and find some arrangement, especially if it is in both of their interests. And I think it's in the interest of Turkey to have a strong relationship with the U.S. I think it's in the interest of the U.S. to have a strong relationship with Turkey. But that doesn't mean that the U.S. can let Turkey do whatever it wants. And so I think the more that Erdogan threatens, the more he escalates, the more he takes military action, the more he threatens military action, that's going to have a hangover effect long term in terms of what's achievable for the foreseeable future. And if Erdogan even inadvertently directs his military in a way that, or I should say, if he directs his military in a way that inadvertently leads to American troop deaths, that is a whole other reality. So I don't think he will go that far. He has specifically said he won't target U.S. troops, but if the U.S. inserts troops as outposts and observation, and in the fog of war, a mistake gets made, then that's going to have a tremendous adverse impact that I think will prevent a wider and deeper alliance from reforming.
Right, and I think I have time for one more last question, sure. And that would be when the Kobani came under threat of ISIS, KRG, or the Kurdistan region in Iraq, played a major role in helping the Kurds in Syria to overcome that challenge there. Do you see any way that KRG could play a role in de-escalating the tensions between Turkey and the northeast Syria in this time?
It's a good question. I actually think it might have the opposite effect. If Erdogan is worried about Kurds from multiple countries conspiring against Turkey, the idea of inserting Kurds from Iraq into Syria, even if in a military sense it helps deter or it helps reinforce, I think it will cause Erdogan to distrust the notion that you can essentially quarantine the Kurdish presence in East Syria. And I think that what the U.S. would try to convey if it's going to bring Turkey and Syria together is that when you try to say, Mr. Erdogan, when you look across the border in Syria, don't think of the Kurds there as part of this massive multinational conspiracy to topple your government. This is a quarantine threat from your perspective, a quarantine variable in Syria that doesn't bleed over across border. And the second you start injecting outside forces into Syria, and East Syria can be construed as a kind of conduit for a wider Kurdish effort, especially if you don't already have a break between the PKK and the YPG, that might inflame Turkish diplomatic sensibilities and political sensibilities to the point where it makes a broader permanent end state agreement harder to achieve.
Thank you so very much, Andrew Bagel,
thank you.
a research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Correct.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching.